Good afternoon, and welcome to the 5th in the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships monthly live chat series. If you're just joining us for the first time, welcome, and if you've participated in previous chats, welcome back. My name is Salaeha Shariff, and I am the Director of Recruitment for the Fellowship Program, and I will be moderating today's chat. Each month during the application cycle, the AAAS S&T Policy Fellowships host a live chat with current and alumni fellows to provide a glimpse into the fellowship experience and highlight the diversity of disciplines, career stages, and experiences that are represented in the program. This is also a chance for you to connect directly with fellows to ask questions about the program as well as the application process. The focus of today's chat is the Judicial Branch Fellowship. The Judicial Fellowship, which is a recently launched program area, was established to provide accomplished scientists and engineers the opportunity to engage with contemporary policy issues facing the judiciary. Judicial Fellows contribute scientific and technical expertise to judicial administration, operations, education programs, protocol and discovery, and courtroom technology. The Judicial Fellowship is served at the Federal Judicial Center here in Washington, D.C. The FJC is the education and research agency for the federal courts and provides research, education, and training to assist federal judges to be better equipped to research decisions based on both good law and good science. The Judicial Fellows serve in the research division of the FJC, and in consultation with the FJC staff, have considerable latitude in determining the areas and the projects that they will work on. Applicants to the judicial program area should demonstrate an interest in legal topics, with prior exposure to legal issues being helpful to establish that interest. Applicants are not required to hold a JD or other legal degree. Eligibility requirements for the Judicial Fellowship are similar to the other AAAS fellowship programs, with the addition of 3 years of professional experience beyond the PhD. I'd like to now introduce our 2 panelists who will be joining the conversation today. First panelist is Shubha Ghosh. Shubha was the 2014-15 Judicial Branch Fellow. At the FJC, he built on his specialties in intellectual property and economic analysis of legal policy. He worked with researchers at the FJC to investigate current policy issues confronting federal courts in addressing patent litigation. Shubha's work built on his background in intellectual property law and policy, and particularly on the role of patent law in promoting innovation and competitiveness. Shubha is currently the director of the Technology Law Program and is the Crandall Melvin Professor of Law at Syracuse University College of Law. His work there focuses on the development and commercialization of technology as a means of promoting economic and social development. Shubha received his PhD in economics and holds a law degree from Stanford Law School. Our second panelist is Joe Cecil. Joe is the Senior Research Associate and Project Director for the Program on Scientific and Technical Evidence at the Federal Judicial Center. Joe serves as a mentor to the Judicial Fellow and works with the Fellow to determine areas of interest and to develop projects for the fellowship year. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
So this is your opportunity for those joining us on the webinar to ask questions and to hear from Shubha and Joe as they discuss the Judicial Fellowship. You can submit a question at any time by clicking in the question box and typing in your question there. Please try to keep your questions short and directed to a particular individual or the whole panel, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible today. So I'd like to begin the chat and start us off with some questions that I have specifically for Shubha. So Shubha, the first question that I have for you is, what were your professional objectives in undertaking the Judicial Fellowship? So sort of what prompted you to decide to apply?
Sure. I guess the main thing that prompted me to apply was how innovative the program was, and it struck me as really an opportunity to, be the initial fellow was pretty exciting, but also to be one where you were really looking at the intersection of science and law and policy making. And so my goals, largely as somebody who had been in teaching a while, was to find a nice opportunity for a sabbatical. I was teaching at the University of Wisconsin when I applied for the fellowship back in 2015, and I thought it would be a nice program to be involved with as part of my sabbatical. both in terms of developing new research areas and to focus on policymaking in DC, as well as getting other perspectives on law and science. I mean, I hate to be so, I don't know what the right description would be, but I got a lot more out of this program than maybe I contributed in some ways. But I think a lot of the things I'm doing are still in the progress in terms of the research I'm doing. So it's really beneficial to get that perspective about law and about science from policymakers in DC, essentially.
Great. And so sort of as a follow-up to that question, now that it's been a year since your fellowship, and sort of reflecting on your time as a judicial fellow, how would you say it's impacted your career path? I know you've had some professional changes while taking on new positions, so can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, it's always hard, I'll speak kind of like a nerdy social scientist here, maybe even like a nerdy lawyer. It's hard to construct social paths, and I guess causal paths rather, and I guess you construct them after the fact. So a lot of the professional developments were going on kind of simultaneously as I was doing the fellowship, but I certainly feel stronger as a researcher and as an instructor, as a teacher, for the experiences that I had and the perspectives that I had. And so I'm hoping that I can, first of all, open up pathways for my students who want to go to DC. We have a fairly active program in Syracuse Law School about other various forms of externships and fellowships for our law students. And hopefully this will open up various paths for them as well, or at least inspire them to pursue that. And I think in terms of just my narrow personal interests, it really has refocused my energies and my thoughts about litigation and about the judicial system as an avenue for policy making, and thinking about patent reform, which is an area that I'm actively involved in, and some of the limits and potentials for patent reform through changes in judicial process, if you put it that way, rather than changes in the actual statute regarding what can be patentable, how, and also changes in the agency. And let me go on a little bit. A lot of this is so many moving pieces. Let me put it that way. So, what I was thinking 2 years from now is maybe very different than what I think now, because you have a more robust use of administrative procedures, and they're interacting in interesting ways with the judicial process for patent enforcement. And so I think my year in the Federal Judicial Center as a AAAS fellow really helped my thinking and kind of brought it up to date where it might have been in 2013, largely informed by my teaching, my writing, and my exposure to civil procedure when I was in law school way back when. So it was really a great refresher and recharge for my own understanding of the judicial process and the way in which patent reform is affected by it.
And so, Joe, you work very closely with the fellow at the FJC. So can you speak a little bit about how the FJC perceives the role of the fellow and how the fellow will be contributing to projects at the FJC?
Certainly. We've had a fellowship program now, the AAAS Fellow. Shubha was the first one, but we have had Judicial and White House Fellows in the past. And what we try to do is develop a project that is both consistent with their academic and intellectual interests, but also a project that's going to inform the judiciary in resolving some of the contemporary issues the judiciary faces. The Federal Judicial Center is an independent education and research agency for the United States federal courts. And as such, we have great access to all of the federal courts and an opportunity to sort of look at the courts and how they're functioning in a more systematic, as a system rather than just as an individual case. And that gives us the opportunity to advise the judiciary in terms of the policies that it may wish to pursue, also offer cautions about various proposals that may restrict access to justice. So the research projects that we undertake and the research projects that we develop with the fellows are projects that are intended to inform the judicial branch about the kind of contemporary issues that have to be resolved in federal litigation.
So as a follow-up to that question, we have a question from the audience. The person's background isn't actually in medical anthropology, and they have interest both in law and policy making around international clinical research. So could you maybe speak to how the Judicial Fellowship might provide an opportunity for professional development for somebody with a medical anthropology background, or just even other, other discipline backgrounds outside of Shubha's or the current incoming Judicial Fellow?
Certainly. Well, as you mentioned, it's not necessary to have a law degree, and in fact, most of our researchers do not have law degrees. They have backgrounds in other areas of science. I think for someone with a medical background, there would be a lot of opportunity to look at how medical information is dealt with in the courts, particularly in cases involving litigation over torts or product liability issues. One of the things we've done at the Federal Judicial Center is to develop a reference manual for judges that provides sort of a primer for judges in various areas of science. And there is one chapter on medical diagnosis. And I think someone with a medical background could be very helpful in helping us, pardon me, in helping us develop various procedures and materials that will inform judges of the proper principles that they should be applying in terms of these diagnostic practices. And just to give you an example of a contemporary issue that I think is a great concern to the federal courts, one of the things that federal judges do is they have to make an assessment not just of whether a toxic element may have harmed may be capable of harming an individual, but whether in fact it harmed a particular individual. Doctors, of course, are making diagnostic decisions about individuals, and the federal courts allow medical professionals to make those diagnostic decisions without a lot of guidance. So certainly someone with a strong medical background would be helpful in bringing more structure, order, and knowledge to that process.
So Shubha, sort of in reflecting back on your fellowship year, could you speak a little bit about how you prepared for your year at the FJC, and then how did you approach the working on your projects?
Sure. How did I prepare? In some ways, I spent 20 years preparing for it without really thinking about it consciously. I think it really, one of the things I really liked about the fellowship is that it really brought out some of the skills that I had been developing, both as a doctoral student, as an economist, and as a law student, and then a practicing attorney and a law professor. So specifically, how I prepared, I don't think I did anything consciously. I know I talked with Joe and the director of the FJC, Jim, before I started. I mean, I got the fellowship award notice in March of 2014, if I remember the date correctly. So that was about 5 or 6 months before I was starting, and I basically talked with as many people within the program as possible, with people in the AAAS as well as people in the FJC where I was placed, and just got a sense of the range of things that were possible, and a range of things that the FJC was involved with in my particular area of expertise. I had, of course, been familiar with the FJC before. That's one of the things that inspired me to apply in the first place. Their materials are well used both in the classroom and as well as by practitioners and as well as by scholars, just to get a lay of the land for the federal judiciary. So I came in at least knowing that aspect of the work product that the FJC produced, and so that was very helpful. I sort of had different projects in mind in terms of hitting the ground with. One I did a little bit of work on having to do with, and this may have some bearing to the previous question regarding patentability of DNA, and then some subsequent cases regarding patentability of medical diagnostics. And I spent some time following those cases. This was the initial decisions came out in 2013 and 14, and so during my period I was able to see at least some of the cases, and I did a presentation at the USPTO based upon some of my work, but that's still an ongoing area of the law. And but I think for your previous question, somebody who's interested in the medical aspects of what goes on in the courts, I would add patent law is another area, because there are some very interesting questions regarding biotechnology and patenting, where I think the insights of a medical anthropologist would be very, very useful. So I worked on that project, and then fortunately, I guess for me, the Supreme Court had come out of the decision a few months before I started my fellowship on attorney fee shifting as a way to control vexatious patent litigation. So that offered a nice almost experiment to look at to see how that case, and that case had overturned a previous case, which again overturned a previous case, so you had some interesting subsamples in the case law to look at to see how changes in rules about attorney fee shifting in patent law, affected outcomes. And that's something I'm still working on as the database and the case law is expanding in this area. And so that was very useful to have that as sort of a background for the projects that I pursued, as a fellow. And so I think I don't know if I'm sort of rambling here, but to try to wrap up a little bit or to put it in a nicer package, I think the best thing to do is to connect with the FJC as soon as you can, get to know people there, and then have a sense of what kind of projects you want to work on and how they fit with the needs of the center.
Shaleha, may I just follow up on a couple of points that Shubha made?
Yes, please.
It was very fortunate that the Supreme Court decided a case in June that was relevant to Shubha's interest and that the Judicial Center was concerned about. And that allowed us to start developing a program before he arrived and to do some groundwork. And that meant that there was very little delay in terms of Shubha starting to work on a project that was of interest and concern to the judiciary. And that's really what we try to do. The other issue is that Shubha mentioned that he's continued to work on these projects. And that's something else that we try to do, find a project that meets both an academic interest of the Judicial Fellow and will be of ongoing interest to the judicial branch. And that allows us to have insights into the scholarly community and contributions to the scholarly community that the Judicial Conference then takes advantage of in setting its policies. So it all worked out very well in Shubha's case, and I think it's going to work out equally well in terms of the incoming fellow who starts in 2 weeks.
And so, Joe, I just wanted to follow up with that, and similar to my question to Shubha, so what advice would you give an incoming Judicial Fellow in terms of preparation for their year at the FJC? What types of things should they be thinking about? Who should they be trying to talk to?
Well, they can always give me a call or Shubha a call to start with. I think in terms of things to think about, remember, we're trying to look for a project that's going to be relevant to a contemporary policy issue that confronts the federal judiciary. So if you think about the issues that are often of concern to the judiciary, they would be things like access to justice. They would involve issues like individuals, pro se individuals, being able to represent themselves in court. Of course, there's a lot of criminal sentencing issues and probation and pretrial research projects that we undertake, as well as projects that determine how individuals can sort of move back into society after a period of incarceration. So I think the first key is to try to identify the topics that are of interest, of policy interest, to the federal courts. The second key will be to be open to a wide variety of questions. The questions that the Judicial Center asks are typically more applied than the kind of questions that often come up in academic research. But the offsetting advantage is that after the research is done, you get to see the Judicial Conference committees, the policy-making branch, or the policy-making committees of the third branch, actually act on that information to consider the research and to try to draw some, make policy decisions in light of that research. And that's a very satisfying opportunity that I think academic researchers sometimes don't have. it helps to have a keen sense of interest in organizational functioning. It helps to sort of think about the judicial branch as a judicial system that's delivering justice, as opposed to sort of a case that deals with litigation on a case-by-case basis. And with that perspective, you'll come in and probably identify a lot of issues that aren't obvious to someone who just starts looking at the judicial branch.
And then Shubha, when you were thinking sort of about your professional objectives for your fellowship, did any of your professional objectives change over the course of your year, or did you feel like you accomplished what you sort of had set in mind prior to the fellowship?
Well, I mean, I'm sort of set in my way, so they couldn't have changed that much. I don't want to sound like also that I went into through too rigidly. I didn't get anything out of the program. I was going to continue in an academic branch. I mean, that's what I'd like to do because there are these opportunities to get involved with policy and to get involved with real-world issues. Certainly, as a law professor, you get to do that probably more so than other academics. So I think it may have hopefully honed my ability to understand those issues. I like Joe's point about understanding the judiciary as a system or as an organization. That's certainly something that became clearer to me. I mean, I don't think that was foreign to me going in before the fellowship, but it became even more so. I mean, I grew up in the D.C. area, and I've spent a lot of time doing other types of programs, in various points of my life, and so it's always a good reminder to know what's going on in Washington, D.C. and how the law gets made. But the judiciary is very distinct from the from the other branches, and that's something that may not come across to people, unless they've had some experience in courts. I mean, I did a federal judicial clerkship after law school, and I've been involved with litigation in various capacities. I wasn't sued or being sued. I meant more as when I was practicing attorney or as a law professor, as a consultant. But so I had a sense of it, but it was really good to see kind of the way things work, the mechanics and so forth, and the education process and the ongoing education process for judges and that type of communication and exchange of ideas, as Joe said, at a very practical level. And so I don't think my objectives changed, but perhaps my my understanding was definitely deepened. Just to add one point to go back to your question about preparation, in case people haven't done this, and certainly it might be worth doing even before, as new applicants prepare their statement and fill out their application, I would actually go and try to look at some FJC publications. Either go on the website and take a deep dive into the website. Look at some of the videos. I finished my fellowship, I think, September of 2015. I went back to Wisconsin to teach one last semester, and I taught a course on IP law, and there was a patent litigation ongoing in the Western District of Wisconsin, where Madison is. And so I had my students visit the trial one day, and lo and behold, the first day of trial, what did the judge do to educate the jurors about is to show an FJC video about patent litigation. So, the publications and the materials that the FJC puts out has a real impact. People see them, and it has an influence. And so I would really advise applicants, as far as their preparation, certainly early on as they prepare their application, and definitely, if they get accepted and move on, to really explore the FJC materials on the website, or go to your local law library, or if there's a federal courthouse nearby, which very likely there will be, take a look at libraries they might have there that should be open to the public. And take a look at FJC materials, and maybe even look at ones that are related to your area of interest and expertise, but even look beyond to get a sense of the range of things that they do. I answered 3 questions there.
Joe, go ahead.
Sure. If you would like to look at the FJC materials, you can go to the FJC website at fjcforfederalJudicialCenter.gov. You'll see descriptions of all of the activities, the nature of the structure of the organization, the educational programs, as well as the research programs. And you can pull down and download for free the publications. Some of you may also be interested in the scientific education programs that the Federal Judicial Center has. The Judicial Center has published a reference manual on scientific evidence in collaboration with the National Academies of Science. And if you go to the National Academies Press at nap.edu, you can download the 1,000-page reference manual that we give to every federal judge that tries to explain the fundamental principles of various areas of science, like statistics, epidemiology. I mentioned there's a chapter on medical causation, mental health, and neuroscience. So those are the kind of publications that I think might be of interest. And we also need to update some of those chapters, so that might be an opportunity as well.
So I wanted to provide an important clarification because I know some of the questions that are coming in. So to clarify that for the Judicial Fellowship, a JD is not required. The required degree is a PhD in one of the sciences or engineering disciplines, including the social sciences. So I just want to, first of all, clarify that. And then, Joe, this question I think is for you, because I think there's some hesitation for people who may be potentially interested in the Judicial Fellowship, but may feel that they're not competitive, either because they don't have a JD degree in addition to the PhD, or they may not have any background or any legal training. So can you speak to a little bit to that, and perhaps for those who don't have a legal training, how they could still be a competitive applicant and what they could bring to the fellowship experience, as well as what they would be able to gain from the experience?
Absolutely. Our research division has 24 professionals. Only a half of those have law degrees. The rest of them are trained in various areas of science, typically social science, typically applied research or statistics. Some political scientists, psychologists, sociologists. We had a neuroscientist who just left for another opportunity on the West Coast. So it's not necessary to have a law degree to do the kind of work we do. As a matter of fact, what we've learned is that we can teach people what they need to know about the law in fairly short order. What's difficult is to find people who have the research skills and the curiosity to frame applied research studies in the context of this ongoing system of litigation and sentencing. So one of the nice things about being able to work together with people like Shubha or people who don't have a law degree, unlike Shubha, is that it gives us a greater breadth of experience and knowledge, and we benefit from that just as well. We benefited greatly from Shubha's background as an economist, for example, because he was able to give us a different perspective on some of our research studies. And I think that's going to be true across a wide range of scientific disciplines. If I can just add one other thing, we do have collaborations with the AAAS and with the National Academy of Sciences, and do a number of projects in science and law that relate to those kinds of issues. We've worked on forensic science topics, the problems of validating forensic science. We've worked on eyewitness identification issues. So there is a rich opportunity in terms of science-based issues that arise in legal settings.
Great. And so, Shubha, can you speak a little bit about sort of the how supportive your colleagues were when you were applying for the fellowship? So perhaps the support they may receive from department chairs or others.
I got a lot. I was lucky enough, or unlucky enough, to look at it. I viewed it as lucky to have as much freedom as I needed. I didn't have any obstacles, and in terms of getting the sabbatical and the leave, it worked out really, really well. So I put together the application myself. I knew some people who had done FJC fellowship, some of the ones that Joe had mentioned, so I did communicate very briefly with them. I mean, not because I didn't want their input, it's just I kind of knew what I wanted to put together for the application, and furthermore, this application would have been a brand, kind of almost sui generis because it was a brand new program. So, but I felt supported. Not to sound too much like a lawyer, I certainly didn't feel unsupported. Put in a double negative there, as lawyers are wont to do. So I felt pretty good about it.
I should add that we recognize that the fellows are coming to us from an academic background and probably going to be returning into an academic background. And we feel an obligation to support them in the kind of professional activities that they will need to maintain when they return to the academic community. So there will be time, for example, to finish up ongoing research papers. And Shubha, I think, spent a number of, traveled to a number of professional conferences to give presentations. We expect that will be an ongoing part of the fellowship.
And so speaking of academia, Shubha, how would you...
And if you're asking about...
So Shubha, this question is for you, and then kind of reflecting back on academia. So the pace of work is very different in academia versus the fellowship. So can you speak a little bit about any conflicts that may have arisen in terms of the desire to be very thorough and maybe have a longer time frame in academia versus the time frame or the constraints that you may have with any fellowship placement, and sort of how you navigated that?
I didn't feel pressured at all. I think it may have been the nature of the Judicial Fellowship. I mean, in terms of work environment, I found the FJC to be more of an academic environment than a, the kind of environment that you might see working in a legislative office or in the executive branch. It wasn't the same sort of the judicial system, doesn't operate on a dime. What I mean by that is they do take a long-term perspective. Judges sort of have to. That's sort of the nature of precedent. So it's academic in that sense of being long-term. So I didn't feel any pressures. I'll try to put this, hope it doesn't come across the wrong way. The same sort of pressures that, for example, my fellows may have felt in the legislative program or the executive program, all of which were great experiences from what I heard, but it was also, my main sense of that is from watching the TV show Veep. So it was nothing like the TV show Veep, if anybody watches that. It was very, very, very intense and very, very involved, but I never felt pressured for anything. I think maybe because Joe and Jim were doing all the, maybe felt all that while the fellows were able to be a little bit more measured.
It depends a little bit also on the nature of the project. As I mentioned, we often do projects that are intended to aid the Judicial Conference in its deliberations. And the Judicial Conference meets twice a year, and so that sort of sets our schedule for being able to deliver specific products to the various Judicial Conference committees. Shubha's topic was of more general interest and was in response to a specific recent Supreme Court case. So he was freed from that kind of 6-month schedule, but there are occasions when we have a fairly fast turnaround in terms of some of the work we need to do.
So Shubha, I know you've spoken a bit with the current incoming Judicial Fellow. So is there any particular advice that you gave him now that he's embarking on his Judicial Fellowship year?
Sure. I mean, not only did I speak with the final fellow, the person who was who accepted the offer, about a year ago when I did this program, I spoke with several of the applicants, and that was also a pleasure to advise them. So I'll try to answer the kind of advice I gave to both Pate, who's the incoming fellow, as well as the many applicants from last fall. And I think a lot of it is repeating what I probably have already said. I mean, have a good sense of how you want to use that year, have a sense of where you'd want to be, a year after you'd start the fellowship, have a pretty well-designed sense of what type of project, even if that may not be the actual project you'll pursue, and it's very likely it may not be because other things may come up in the interim. But really have a sense of what you would like to do during that year and how your expertise will both benefit that project and how you would benefit from being involved in it. And I do want to repeat, I guess, that it is helpful to look at the FJC documents. As Joe mentioned, look at the website, but really take a deep dive into the website in terms of maybe looking at the publications and downloading things and really looking at what the FJC produces. So I think it will be eye-opening and kind of exciting, and I think without being too dramatic about it, it actually probably increase your enthusiasm for the kind of work that happens at the FJC. So I would really recommend doing that, to have a sense of how you draft your own proposal, and then how, if you are chosen as a judicial fellow for the following year, how you would approach the organization and the various individuals that constitute that organization.
So, Joe, both Shubha and the current Judicial Fellow both bring a different set of skill set and expertise to the FJC. So, can you speak a little bit about how you worked with each of them, to develop their portfolio for the year?
It's necessary to get first, it's necessary for us to have a keen understanding of the interests of the fellow, and then we're typically able to find some kind of overlap in terms of the work of the Judicial Center, the interest of the Judicial Conference Committees, and the academic interest of the individual. I know the incoming fellow is a neuroscientist, and in fact, we have a number of projects that involve neuroscience, issues that are increasingly coming into court and judges are finding it difficult to deal with the kind of neuroscience evidence they encounter. So I expect one of the things that the incoming fellow will do is aid us in terms of preparing some materials to guide judges in terms of their assessment of the evidence. As I mentioned, we also have projects with AAAS and the National Academy of Science, and one of those projects involves an issue of implicit bias and the extent to which implicit bias is an issue in terms of the deliberations of federal judges. Again, we expect the incoming fellow to assist us in understanding the neuroscience basis of attitude formation, memory recall, and provide information about how to both recognize implicit bias and guard against various kinds of effects of such biases in terms of the judicial deliberations. So it's very much a process of working together with the fellow to identify overlapping areas of interest and trying to frame a project that the fellow can come in, begin to work on, have a product at the end of the year that will be useful to the judiciary, but also that the fellow will take back into academia and use as a topic of ongoing research and ongoing interest. And that's something that we expect will continue to benefit the judiciary long after the fellow leaves. The work that Shubha is doing on attorney fees is one example of that sort of ongoing benefit.
So, Joe, when you mentioned sort of that product, would that be a white paper, a briefing? Like, what would that product look like?
Well, it can be any number of things. In Shubha's case, it turned out to be a draft of a paper on the changing practices of awards of attorney's fees in patent litigation and advice to judges about how to consider the new legal standards that were presented by the Supreme Court in making those awards of attorney's fees. In other instances, it might be an educational document for judges, something that would guide judges' deliberations in various areas of science. We've had other fellows who have come in and they've built a data set from published opinions, a data set that can be used for sort of ongoing research in terms of a different area. So the product of that year is something that's very specific to the fellow and specific to the area of research that's undertaken by the fellow.
So Shubha, in reflecting back on your fellowship experience, is there anything that you would have done differently or approached something in a different way?
Let's see, that's a good question. I mean, I think I would have, it's hard to say. I mean, I did put together, Joe mentioned putting together the data set, and I did a lot of that on my own, and I probably could have benefited from, just personally, benefited from working more closely with IT and people who are more familiar with these types of databases and data sets within the center. I mean, I did interact a little bit with that, but it may have just been my notion of the project is that I wanted to put together the databases. I don't know, this reminds me, that's something I never really discussed with Joe as I was exiting, is I do still have these databases and spreadsheets. Maybe we can talk about how we can make some better use of that. Sure. But there are lots of expertise on on the statistical side of things, that type of analysis. And I did get some feedback, and that was very helpful, but perhaps I would have spent a little bit more time doing that rather than trying to develop sort of the legal, or focusing largely on what would be the legal and economic analysis of attorneys' fees. But I think, I thought my interactions were sort of on a long-term basis, so I think I think I spent the year, from my perspective, as laying a good foundation for that project with some work product. But this issue that I worked on is not going away, so I'm hoping that some of the things I could have done better or focused on more during my year, I can go back to and sort of expand upon.
So we have just about under 15 minutes left here in the conversation, so I just wanted to remind our audience that if you have any questions for Shubha or Joe, to go ahead and submit that so we can get your question answered live during the chat. And then one question that I had actually for both Shubha and Joe is, what advice would you give to the Judicial Fellow in terms of, or someone who's even considering the Judicial Fellowship, in terms of a strategic approach to career success after the fellowship? So how can the Judicial Fellowship really kind of positively impact a career, whether it's a career in academia, outside of academia, in government, in nonprofit, or even in industry? So Shubha, perhaps.
Yeah. One of the advantages of the fellowship is it will allow the fellow to understand the emerging issues that are confronting the federal courts, and probably have a better understanding of which issues are emerging and how they're going to affect the court than those who are not part of the judicial system. Time and time again, what we've seen is that the topics that have been of concern to the judiciary then start to filter their way into academia after the judges have recognized the nature of the problem. Let me give you an example. One of the big changes in terms of litigation in the United States, in both federal and state courts, has been the movement away from resolving cases through trials, and instead resolving cases through various kinds of preliminary motions. This results in a system where the administration of justice is less visible. And we are now trying to develop data sets that will allow a better understanding of how cases are being resolved through these preliminary motions. Presently, the data sets were set up at times when trials were more common. But someone, for example, who came to the Judicial Center would then get a keener understanding of this shift away from the more visible trial system and toward this system of resolving cases by procedural motion, understand the nature of the concerns that have animated a great debate within the judiciary about whether or not this is an appropriate means of rendering justice, and then could go back into academia and develop this topic in the nature through scholarly articles and academic contributions, which would be, I think, of great benefit to the individual's academic career, and certainly would be a benefit to the judiciary. So that's kind of one of the ways that I think this system kind of comes together.
And then Shubha?
Yeah, substantively on that last point that Joe made, I mean, I think it's worth emphasizing just to get a sense of the dynamism of the fellowship. Another area, in addition to what Joe mentioned regarding pretrial motions, is the area of settlement. And one of the research projects I'm working on, I've worked on it a little bit, I'm moving ahead on it this semester, is on settlements in the context of administrative proceedings in front of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. I won't go into the trees about this, but just to give you a sense of the contours of the forest, sometimes parties settle a litigation. The judge has to approve the settlements in many federal causes of action. And so it never really even gets to pretrial, or it might, kind of hover over pretrial, or it might happen in the shadow of pretrial. And so that raises some very interesting questions about the way in which justice is being administered, whether it's being done in this sort of private fashion. And this is particularly troubling in the area of patent law, where Congress has created these mechanisms to test the validity of patents. And sometimes the patent owner just settles with the party challenging the patents. And so I'm not, I mentioned this partly to advertise this research project and this problem, because I think it's a really interesting problem. But my interest in this problem came directly out out of a National Academy meeting that Joe was very kind to have me attend, and that was back in October of 2014, where this issue was just very briefly mentioned. So I think in general this issue of settlement is important, and that's another area where you see sort of the practical aspects of the judicial system, as well as the interaction between non-legal mechanisms in this case and the legal process. So I just want to probably to thank Joe for making that research project possible, but also to or at least to light the fuse to make it possible. I hope it won't blow up. But another great side benefit of that fellowship, and that's kind of a long way of answering your question. That is, you never know what the benefits are going to be. So it's kind of my paternalistic advice is not to plan overly much regarding what the benefits are. Somewhat, is to just enjoy the experience and really delve into that experience, and have your goals, have your sense of what you want to get out of it, but also be open that you might be in a very different place a year after you start the fellowship than when you even applied for the fellowship. Having said that, I do know that one of the goals of the AAAS fellowship, from my experience with the orientation, by the way, I love that orientation program. It really opened up a lot of, that part was really a big part of the learning experience of some of the programs that AAAS put together. But one of the things that came out of that program is how the goals of the program are to bridge the gap between being an academic, being a researcher, having that kind of focus within an academic culture, and bridging larger professional opportunities, whether it's in policy making, whether it's in law, whether it's in consulting, and so forth. And so I would really emphasize the skills. I think if I were to put one skill at the top of the list that I think a fellow should get out of this program, especially the judicial program, but I think this would apply to all the other ones as well, is to learn how to communicate with somebody outside your field. I mean, that's one of the things I think that may have been common to every fellow. I don't mean this in a negative way, I meant this in a positive way, is that, and including me in this, of course, is that we're all highly specialized. We're used to talking with people who know what we're talking about, or at least can figure out with little effort, or at least they have the interest to try to figure out what we're doing. But I think the beauty of these placements is that you get to communicate with people outside your field and not only learn from them, but also learn how to explain what you do to other people. And that's probably the most valuable skill you can get, out of this type of fellowship, is to kind of expand your horizons beyond the narrow bands of whatever you're, admittedly, great research you've been doing, but you're now trying to kind of bring it out and have some bearing not only on your professional advancement, but also on the real world. So that's probably the #1 goal I think I would emphasize for fellows in the future.
Great. So I think we're actually coming to the close of our hour together. I think this has been a really great chat, and I hope people have been able to sort of see the breadth of opportunities within the Judicial Fellowship, and that even with not having sort of a legal background, it still really does allow you to contribute quite a bit to the FJC. So I wanted to wrap up by asking both Joe and Shubha this sort of our final question here is, for faculty specifically, but also people who are more sort of just mid to senior in their career, so maybe not necessarily in academia, but in sectors outside of academia, why should someone consider applying to the Judicial Fellowship? So if you had to sort of give a short 1 or 2 sentence response to that, what would you say?
Well, I think the Judicial Fellows will have the opportunity to see the judicial policies being made on a real-time basis. And quite often those policies will be based on the kind of information that the Judicial Fellow has gathered, collected, compiled, and then presented to those judicial committees. That's a remarkable opportunity, and I think that's a rare experience in the life of most academics and most non-academics. The other thing I would say is that it's a chance to recognize these emerging issues and build a career, or at least a portion of a career, on capitalizing on those issues. Issues like national security trials, issues like election law problems and employment discrimination. All of these are becoming more and more important, and all of these need the kind of sustained research effort that we expect that fellows can bring to the task. I think it's a great opportunity.
And Shubha?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for academics to look to see what impact their work is going to have, and for those who want to take a change from a research track or from a teaching track or from very broadly construed academic track, I think the fellowship is very helpful in terms of getting your experience in a policy framework, working within an office, working within an organization that doesn't have the same kind of bureaucratic constraints and incentives like an academic organization does. You really have to be collaborative, or you learn how to do that. And so I think those skills can translate into lots of different career opportunities beyond just research, consulting. Certainly, if you want to work in Washington, D.C., having this type of fellowship experience is very important and can certainly open doors. And even if you want to get involved with state government, certainly a lot of the work that the federal judiciary does also has implications for state policy and state courts. So if you wanted to look at that forum, this is also a very great avenue to pursue that.
Great. Thank you, Joe and Shubha. I think that was really great. So that brings us to the end of our time, and I wanted to thank Shubha and Joe for joining us today, as well as all of our participants in the audience. And if we weren't able to answer your questions today, please email us at fellowships@AAAS.org, and we will respond to you via email. And then plan to join us on September 21st for the 6th chat in this monthly series, where you'll have the opportunity to hear from fellows with a background in social sciences and how social scientists contribute to policy via the AAAS S&T Policy Fellowship program. You can find a list of all the upcoming chats in this series, as well as on-demand links for previous chat sessions on the chat page on the Fellowship's website. And as a reminder, we're currently accepting applications for the 2017-18 fellowship year, and the deadline to apply is November 1st. Visit the Fellowship's website for full details related to all the program areas, as well as the application process. And just as a reminder, applicants are allowed, you can apply to a minimum of up to maximum of up to 2 program areas, and you are encouraged to do so. So the Judicial Fellowship is one of the 7 program areas that you can apply to. So again, I wanted to thank both Shubha and Joe for joining us today, and you, the audience, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.